This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. On this 9th day of the occupation of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, a solution to the crisis remains as elusive as ever. The Palestine Liberation Organization reportedly has given up its efforts to mediate an end to the trouble. In retaliation for the embassy occupation and the holding of more than 60 American hostages, President Carter ordered a halt to all U.S. purchases of Iranian oil. He said this, quote, will be a test of our strength and determination. And a short time later, Iran announced an oil embargo against the United States. We have reports from Leslie Stahl at the White House and Randy Daniels in Tehran.
President Carter decided not to wait for the Iranians to announce an embargo. At 1:45 p.m. Eastern Time, working through diplomatic channels, he informed Iranian authorities of his decision, and then went on television to tell the American people that he was taking the initiative.
It is necessary to eliminate any suggestion that economic pressures can weaken our stand on basic issues of principle. Our position must be clear. I am ordering that we discontinue purchasing of any oil from Iran for delivery to this country. I urge every American citizen and every American business to redouble efforts to curtail the use of petroleum products. This action will pose a real challenge to our country.
High administration officials believe that through today's action, they have removed a bargaining tool that can no longer be used in dealing with the hostages. Top officials say they considered very, very carefully the safety of the prisoners and concluded that this will not be seen as a provocative action, although reporters were told that there is no precise way to predict the response of the terrorists. Other officials say candidly that today's announcement was also intended to dampen the outrage and frustration expressed by Americans over the country's seeming helplessness. In handling the crisis, the president is now moving beyond his early strategy of working solely through diplomatic avenues. Over the weekend, he began deportation proceedings against Iranian students in this country illegally. Other actions under consideration include a food embargo, a freezing of Iranian assets in the U.S., and possibly organizing an international oil boycott against Iran. But with all that and continued diplomatic pressures, one top official said, "We are not any closer to getting the hostages out than we were a week ago." And there was an admission that today's action was indeed a calculated risk. Leslie Stahl, CBS News, the White House.
President Carter's announcement caught Iranian officials by surprise. A ban on Iranian oil imports in the United States was a step people thought here impossible by the world's largest oil user. Sadiq Ghozadeh, a leading member of the ruling Revolutionary Council, said tonight that Iran had decided to cut oil supplies to the United States effective tomorrow, and that President Carter's decision was a welcome and profitable one for Iran.
This is definitely not unfavorable to Iran, and we have enough customers, and we sell the oil in the more favorable prices in the free market.
Students occupying the embassy here and their supporters in universities and government offices have begun a fast, eating one meal at sunset each day to show their resolve, hoping to reduce Iran's vulnerability to a possible food embargo by the United States. As the siege entered its second week, Iran also appealed to Islamic and European countries to urge the United States to recognize the Shah as a war criminal, send him back for trial, freeze his assets, and stop meddling in Iran's internal affairs. A delegation of religious leaders came to praise and pray with the students, who have held 100 people in captivity for 9 days inside this compound, 60 of them Americans. One of them is a Marine Guard named Kevin Hermany, who, along with 33 other hostages, signed a letter urging President Carter to return the Shah to Iran to stand trial. Hermany was interviewed by one of his captors.
Who is Mr. Carter, the leader, the President of the United States, to put a price on our lives in opposition to putting the price with the Shah? Because there's all of us Americans here who I think his priorities should lie with first. And he's got one Shah in the United States. I think that they should lie with us first, because we are Americans.
And for the second straight day, the military has demonstrated its support for the students. This time, the Army came to show its solidarity. The anti-American sentiment near the embassy is constant and intense. The political slogan steady and repetitious. Down with America, death to Carter, death to the Shah. To the joy of pro-Khomeini supporters here and elsewhere, demonstrators are setting fire to American flags to underscore their anger and contempt for America's government, they insist, not her people. The students are preparing for a long siege of the embassy to press their demands for the return of the Shah, world opinion notwithstanding. With the backing of Ayatollah Khomeini and vocal popular support, they see no pressing need to release their hostages or to relinquish control over the embassy itself. Randy Daniels, CBS News, Tehran.
Iran had its share of domestic troubles today. Hundreds of Iranians demanding jobs stormed the Labor Ministry building in Tehran. They were dispersed by Islamic Revolutionary Guards who fired rifles in the air. In Iran's troubled Kurdistan province, Kurdish rebels launched new offensives on several towns. Iran's official news agency reported several persons killed or wounded. Iran, after its February revolution, ceased to be a major supplier of oil to the United States. This is one reason why today's ordered cutoff may have little impact on Americans. More from Nelson Benton.
U.S. imports of Iranian oil have fluctuated since the first cutoff, but have not returned to pre-revolutionary levels. Until the president halted imports from Iran, they amounted to not quite 4% of U.S. consumption. About 2 months' supplies from Iran are probably still on the high seas, since that is the approximate steaming time to U.S. ports. American companies have been building stocks of crude oil and products since the last shutoff and should be better prepared to deal with this one. Gasoline stocks are slightly above what they were this time last year. Heating oil and other middle distillate storage is substantially higher. Administration officials say some Iranian oil may filter through other countries into the United States, either before or after it is refined, a view shared by industry experts.
We don't at this point, of course, know whether Iran will maintain its current production levels and sell that 600,000 or 700,000 barrels a day to other countries. If that were to happen, then we would simply have a reshuffling of crude sources coming into the United States.
Senate Energy Chairman Henry Jackson endorsed the action, but thinks intermittent gas lines are likely.
The psychological aspect of this will refresh memories earlier in the year. With the Iranian cutoff, we then went to the gas lines. It will mean higher prices, regrettably.
Administration officials from the president on down pleaded for more conservation.
Just a little less discretionary driving, and we cover this whole source of oil. And if it's just discretionary driving that's cut out, for example, there should be no impact on output or on prices or other things, except maybe favorably.
Another official said that 3 miles a day less for every car in the United States would make up the Iranian difference. Nelson Benton, CBS News, Washington.
At least some of the shortfall created by the Iranian oil cutoffs expected to be taken up by Saudi Arabia. Saudi Prince Abdullah said today his country is prepared to continue producing more oil than is needed for its own development, in his words, to keep the world economy going. But the Saudis reportedly will increase their oil prices to levels charged by other OPEC producers before next month. California's Governor Jerry Brown announced he is reimposing odd even-day gasoline rationing Sunday. Brown explained he's doing so to further California's conservation effort and, quote, make sure that California does its part as part of a national effort of solidarity. Last week's report that the growth in the money supply has slowed offset concern about the Iranian oil cutoff, and the stock market was way up today in moderate trading. At the center of this diplomatic storm is the exiled Shah of Iran being treated in a New York City hospital for cancer. It's his return to Iran to stand trial that the Khomeini government says is the price for the release of those Americans. More on this story from Marvin Kalb at the State Department.
The U.S. has made it clear in every way possible that it wants the Shah to leave the country as soon as possible, as soon as it can be determined that his medical treatment is finished or can be continued elsewhere. But even then, officials here are not certain that the hostages will be released. They've asked the question, but Iranian officials have not come through with a clear answer. Only two things are clear. The administration will not return the Shah to Iran, and political asylum for him in this country is out of the question. Spokesman Harding Carter put as much distance as he could between this administration and the Shah without seeming to be submitting to Iranian blackmail. For example, in the U.S. view, does the Shah have any claim to power in Iran?
We do not regard him as having any political claim upon leadership in Iran. We have repeatedly made it clear to them that we are not engaged in or interested in, or in fact would be involved in or support any effort to overturn the authority now in place in Iran and replace it with that of the Shah or any other outside force.
The spokesman tried to counter a spreading bleak impression that all diplomatic trails have led to a dead end. He said the U.S. continues to press forward in a number of different ways, but he did not identify them or offer any particular hope of an imminent breakthrough. Diplomatic sources involved in the private negotiations say that getting the Shah to leave so it looks as though he is going voluntarily is a compromise that would not be too embarrassing to the United States. Marvin Kalb, CBS News, the State Department.
Before coming to the United States, the Shah lived temporarily in Mexico. Today, that country said it is closing temporarily its embassy in Tehran because of the situation there. In Los Angeles today, there was an Iranian student demonstration supporting the embassy takeover and the now common anti-Iranian reaction. Barry Peterson reports.
500 gathered in a pro-Iranian demonstration were met by hecklers at the UCLA campus. Iranian students worry about a backlash and say Americans don't fully understand the motives behind the embassy takeover.
I think you may, in fact, have the right not to like what has happened in Iran. At least try to understand how this anguish, this hatred, this abhorrement have accumulated for the last 25 years.
At the University of Southern California, with a large Iranian student population, there is little sympathy for Iranian students supporting the takeover.
They were even pleased about it, to be saying maybe nothing and smiling among themselves. That would make sense, but to be marching openly is just asking to get their head knocked in.
I'm very hype on the statement, America love it or leave it. Why our country? I feel for that reason they don't have enough credibility to be here to do it. In other words, they should do it in their own country.
The House of Iran in Beverly Hills sells carpets and other Iranian goods. Now, says the owner, business suffers from a growing American resentment against Iran. He plans to change the store's name.
We used to have a lot of businesses here, people to walk in, even window shopper, they're scared to come in. The attitude of the people at this moment is very rough toward us.
After years of friendship from Americans, said Sayeri, now there are daily telephone threats on his life. Barry Peterson, CBS News, Los Angeles.
In Denver, a 21-year-old Iranian student, Asfin Shariati, was advised formally in court that he is being held on 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of criminal attempted first-degree murder. Police said the Iranian fired a rifle yesterday at 3 youths who broke his window. 1 was killed, the others were wounded. Shariati is being held without bail. CBS News will present a special report on the Iranian crisis tonight at 11:30, 10:30 Central Time. The Soviet Union, in an unusually candid admission, said today it is faced with an energy shortage and called on the country to practice strict conservation measures. Israeli Prime Minister Begin's in more political trouble. His fragile coalition government lost a parliamentary vote that would have restricted abortions. Some coalition members did not support the measure, and this angered an ultra-religious party, which has now threatened to withdraw its support to the Begin government. If this happens, Begin most likely would not be able to withstand a challenge. In Campaign 76, the question was Jimmy who? For Campaign 80, it might well be George who. Richard Roth has the story.
Some days it's the little things that give a boost to George Bush, like being recognized at the airport in Madison, Wisconsin.
It's good for the morale. I don't know what it does for hers, but it does a lot for mine.
Though he's served in Congress as a representative from Texas, he's headed the CIA, the U.S. mission to the UN, the U.S. Liaison Office in Peking, and the Republican Party. While he's been campaigning for the presidential nomination for more than 6 months and has raised more than $3 million, George Bush is a mystery to most people. More than a mystery, he's almost a secret.
Who is he that you're taking pictures of?
I see somebody else on the cover of Newsweek, see someone else on the cover of Time, say, gee, wouldn't it be great to be me? But I have no, if I'm being honest with you, there's no reason to put me on there yet. There will be when I get through, though.
The way George Bush hopes to build recognition is by following up his surprise win in Maine's straw vote with strong showings in the early contests that count, Iowa and New Hampshire, developing enough momentum to force Howard Baker out of the race in Alabama or Florida, and eventually rolling over Ronald Reagan. Frequently called a moderate, but saying only that he believes in old-fashioned values, Bush sees himself as the GOP's prime alternative to Reagan. But on the campaign trail, it's not the Republicans that he attacks.
I say that the Teddy Kennedys, the Jimmy Carters who have promised and promised absolutely everything and spent this country to the verge of bankruptcy, I say they are the ones that are victimizing the working man and woman in this country. And we better wake up and make the people understand that.
Bush advocates strict limits on the growth of federal spending, tax cuts aimed at boosting business investment, decontrol of oil prices with measures to spur private development of new energy sources, and, drawing on his tenure as CIA chief, improved intelligence to help reverse what he calls the decline in America's stature overseas. On Iran, for example, last week he said America should have a paramilitary contingency plan.
Quiet diplomacy, strong representations to the Iranians that this kind of illegal, outrageous behavior cannot be condoned. And then the second thing he ought to do, and I believe this is, perhaps he's doing it, is to have some kind of a fallback, some kind of a contingency plan. The United States must not be impotent in the face of this kind of outrageous, illegal aggression.
Bush's critics claim his reputation is that of a proven bad campaigner. Both times he ran for statewide office from Texas, he lost. And in a poll at a recent Washington party of national political reporters and consultants, Bush was overwhelmingly voted the Republicans' second choice. Even so, Bush says he'll win the nomination for three reasons. His stand on the issues is one. Another is organization, a campaign staff based in Houston, Texas and Alexandria, Virginia, led by veterans of the 1976 campaigns of Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan. And the third reason is desire. George Bush says he wants to be president more than anyone else. Richard Roth, CBS News, with the Bush campaign in Wisconsin.
For just about everyone in this country, and especially for the relatives of the hostages in Tehran, there is a feeling of frustrated helplessness. But amidst all the diplomatic gloom, there may be a slight ray of relief. We have reports from Bernard Kalb at the State Department and Bob Fall in Scales Mound, Illinois.
An arrangement has reportedly been reached with the Iranians to allow the families in the U.S. to communicate with the hostages in Tehran by letter. Informed sources are extremely reluctant to talk about the matter because of its sensitivity. But what they are saying is that the arrangement was reached just last night, with representatives of the Iranians holding the Americans. These sources say that if the arrangement works, and they emphasize the word if, only one-way traffic will be allowed from the families to the hostages, with the letters presumably conveyed by a third country. Bernard Kalb, CBS News, the State Department.
But the State Department has given an address now that we can write to the hostages.
This morning, when a State Department officer gave that information to Mrs. Clara Holland, she concluded that the hostage stalemate would not end soon for the Americans, including her 52-year-old son, Leland, an Army officer the last 27 years, the father of 6 who grew up on this farm in western Illinois.
I pray, and sometimes I get provoked about it, and you get over it, and then I get worried, and then there's a lump comes, and you can't eat, and you can't swallow, and that's the way it is.
And some days, she says, the pain is especially hard to take.
I think it's too bad that any American soldier that's put in 27 years should have to spend an armistice day in a place like that.
So Clara Holland plans to write soon to her hostage son because she says it would cheer him up and cheer her up, too. Bob Fall, CBS News, Scales Mound, Illinois.
And that's the way it is, Monday, November 12th, 1979. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News. Good night.
This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. For the first time since the Iranian crisis began 10 days ago, the Tehran government has listed two so-called proposals that it says will diplomatically solve the problem. In an open letter to UN Secretary General Waldheim, Iran's acting foreign minister called for an urgent Security Council meeting to hear his country's side of the story. The letter demands that the United States accept the investigation of what it calls the Shah's guilt and return to Iran the wealth the Shah allegedly stole. There is no direct mention in the letter of the occupation of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran or the holding of more than 60 American hostages. Nor is there any repeat of earlier demands that the Shah, who's in a New York City hospital, be returned to Iran. But in Tehran, the Muslim students holding the embassy remain steadfast in their demand that nothing short of the Shah's extradition will end the crisis. The State Department declined any immediate comment on this letter. Before the letter was released at the UN, an Iranian official in Tehran was spelling out the proposals, and Randy Daniels has that story.
The Iranian government inched away only slightly from its hardline stand. A leading member of the Revolutionary Council, Sadiq Ghotsadeh, proposed a three-step process that could get Iran and the United States talking to each other again. But the proposal would compel the United States to accept, in their words, the possibility that the Shah has committed criminal offenses. The Iranians say this would legitimize their demands for an investigation of the Shah's activities.
He is a criminal. He has killed over 100,000 of our people. But accepting the fact that he could be criminal by the United States government to allow an international team that we choose ourselves to go and ask the questions, the principal questions, why he has done all these.
Ghotsadeh said this procedure is essential to any discussion over the release of the hostages.
If these two conditions are met by the American government, I'm sure the situation will change for the better.
Ghotsadeh also guaranteed the security of all foreigners here and reassured other foreign governments that Iran would not allow any other embassies to be seized. That was not good enough for Mexico, which evacuated its embassy personnel yesterday amid reports that the Shah may return to a life of exile there once he is released from the hospital. While adopting a more diplomatic approach, Ghotsadeh reaffirmed his government's intention to have the Shah extradited.
I believe that we'll get him. Sooner or later, we'll get him. There is no doubt about it.
While the Iranians were sending out new diplomatic signals, they were also orchestrating support for the students occupying the American embassy. The morning crowds were small, but by mid-afternoon, waves of pro-Khomeini supporters converged on the embassy. The solidarity is clear. The carnations, a symbol of the Iranian Revolution, flow freely, a romantic gesture of commitment and support. With such emotional support, it is easy to understand the students' defiance. At a news conference today, their message was blunt. They will not release their hostages until the Shah is returned to Iran to face trial. We are prepared to wait as long as it takes, the students said, no matter how long. Randy Daniels, CBS News, Tehran.
Late this afternoon, Secretary of State Vance told reporters that there has been no change in the Iranian situation, and he could not assure that the embassy occupation would not drag on for weeks. He added that not all the diplomatic initiatives have failed, but he would not elaborate. There were these other developments in the Iranian story. President Carter canceled a trip to Pennsylvania so that he could closely monitor the situation. The House voted 379-0 to ban all further aid to Iran. The U.S. aircraft carrier Midway sailed from Mombasa, Kenya to the Arabian Sea for what the Pentagon said was a naval exercise unrelated to the embassy occupation. The Iranian government closed its airspace to American planes, a move with little practical effect since no U.S. planes now fly to Tehran. It may mean some detouring around the country. No word on U.S. retaliation. And the State Department said it has opened a direct phone line now with the embassy and has talked with the student occupiers. There are an estimated 50,000 Iranian students in this country, and today Attorney General Civiletti, under President Carter's order, told them to report to the Immigration and Naturalization Service within 30 days to prove they are here legally. The order is a direct result of the embassy occupation and the numerous pro-Iran demonstrations by many of those students. Fred Graham reports from Washington.
The announcement of the details by Acting Immigration Chief David Crossland gave the impression that the deportation program is largely symbolic at this point because it leans heavily on voluntary cooperation. Iranians on student visas are instructed to report to immigration offices or special centers that will be set up on some campuses and to bring passports and proof of student status. Those who are found to have dropped out, gone to work, or otherwise violated their student status will be subjected to deportation proceedings. Crossland was asked how the department would find deportable students who would be highly unlikely to turn themselves in.
We seek them out by following leads that we may have as to their whereabouts. Oftentimes, our experience shows that students who have stopped attending school stay around the college where they were in attendance, and we will follow up those leads. We expect to get further leads from interviewing those students who do come in.
In Chicago, immigration officials worried openly about how they would find all the students in their area.
It's going to be a considerable amount of time.
6 months?
I should imagine anyway that. I think that's probably conservative.
Year?
Well, you're talking about the location of 6,500 people. We may never locate all 6,500.
Court challenges are expected to be filed quickly, contesting the constitutionality of singling Iranians out for deportation, and only Iranian students at that. Asked why the government did that, the only answer the immigration chief could give was that the president ordered it. Fred Graham, CBS News, Washington.
2 Iranians who arrived just last night at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport were being held today pending deportation hearing. A 3rd Iranian who lives in Chicago also was being held. Federal officials would give no details and would not say whether the incident is connected to the hostage crisis. In televised announcements pre-recorded for broadcast tonight, former California Governor Ronald Reagan formally entered the Republican presidential race he generally is conceded to be leading. Jerry Bowen reports.
Ronald Reagan, the candidate in 1968.
We can go on pinning our faith in a government that has shown no faith in the people, or we can rediscover our own great ability to govern ourselves.
The challenger and loser in 1976.
The invasion of private rights, the controls and restrictions on the vitality of the great free economy that we enjoy. These are our challenges that we must meet.
And today, the front runner, sounding his familiar theme.
Will we begin the world over again? Or will we face our children, or possibly our children's children someday, when they ask us where we were and what we were doing on the day that freedom was lost in America?
Ronald Reagan's message has remained constant, a conservative message, a vision of America where profits and freedom are inseparable. His campaign staff from 4 years ago is back virtually intact, egos and rough edges smoothed over.
Hello, this is Ronald Reagan.
The candidate who has kept his name alive through public appearances, syndicated columns, and broadcast commentaries is prepared to contest every primary, every caucus state. The 1980 model Reagan will be shown as a practical, problem-solving man. From his sometimes shuffled stack of cue cards, Reagan will continue to deliver his well-worn one-liners.
There was an old lady who lived in a shoe. That's all she could afford for $80,000.
And he will still talk tough.
Shouldn't we stop worrying about whether the other parts of the world like us and decide that we're going to be once again respected?
But Reagan and his advisors want him to be perceived as a leader, the man with the answers, the way they have always seen him.
Let us say to the Soviet Union, look, we'll sit down at a table with you and negotiate an agreement which reduces the number of nuclear weapons on each side to the point that neither one of us represents a threat to each other. We will not legitimize an arms race and call it a strategic arms limitation treaty when it isn't.
Fundraising is not a problem at this stage, according to a Reagan spokesman.
And all the words are true.
But even with celebrity help, the Reagan drive lags behind the fundraising efforts of the Conley campaign, which has amassed almost twice as much. But there is one potential problem over which the 68-year-old Reagan has no control, the age question. He would be the oldest major party nominee in history, an issue whispered about at party gatherings, asked about at news conferences. Mr. Reagan, how do you fight talk in the nation that you're too old to be president?
Well, I'd skip rope through the neighborhood and...
His campaign staff hopes to further diffuse it with the release of a medical statement which pronounces him in normal health with no evidence of any ongoing medical problems. Our latest poll indicates that while 58% of the voters don't believe age makes any difference, more than a third said they would be less likely to vote for someone over age 65. Reagan, crow's feet crinkling with his smile, says there is nothing wrong with a little maturity.
I've been very fortunate. I'm very healthy, and as I say, I don't think it's much of an issue. For one thing, it has an advantage. I didn't have to ask my mother whether I could run.
Jerry Bowen, CBS News, New York.
With his announcement, Reagan enters a Republican presidential race already crowded with candidates. More on that from Bruce Morton.
The field is smaller than the Boston Marathon, but not much. Look at them all. John Anderson, Howard Baker, George Bush, John Connally, Philip Crane, Robert Dole, Ben Fernandez, Larry Pressler. But these candidates and their campaign managers agree they are all trailing now and agree on who's out front.
Governor Reagan.
Well, the front runner is Ronald Reagan.
Reagan. He's clearly ahead.
Different campaigns have different plans for catching Reagan. Most experts think Connally, Baker, and Bush have the best shot. Connally has concentrated his campaign in New York, the Middle West, and the South, where he hopes to win.
That's where Governor Reagan is perceived as having his greatest strength, and that if we are successful in defeating him in the South in one of those 4 primaries, or preferably more than one of those 4 primaries, that would provide us the catalyst we need to go on.
Baker has done all his campaigning since announcing in the East and Middle West.
We believe that he must beat Reagan by some of the middle primaries in the Midwest. That could come through the stretch of Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, in due course. We believe that he will do so at that point, and maybe not until that point.
Bush has concentrated where Jimmy Carter and George McGovern did, Iowa, New Hampshire. Winning early for him is crucial. Everybody agrees it could all be over by April.
If somebody does not defeat Ronald Reagan, by the time you get through the Wisconsin primary, that it's going to be very difficult to do it after that time.
According to the polls and other available evidence, Reagan's lead is substantial and shows no signs of slipping. Still, frontrunners don't always win. If they did, we'd all remember the Muskie administration and President Romney. Bruce Morton, CBS News, Washington.
In Birmingham, Alabama today, Richard Arrington took the oath of office as mayor, the first black mayor in the city's history. State Supreme Court Justice Janie Shores administered the oath in an auditorium filled with more than 5,000 guests. Among them, by Arrington's invitation, former Governor George Wallace. The House has rejected a bill to make the late Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, January 15th, a national holiday. A majority favored the legislation, 252 to 133, but that was just short of the 2/3 majority required under the parliamentary procedure which brought the measure to a vote. One representative, Ohio Republican John Ashbrook, said he opposed the bill because of what he called the slain civil rights leaders' anti-American statements about U.S. involvement in Vietnam.
This is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. The United States and Iran today expanded their diplomatic war to the economic battlefield. Following word from Iran that it planned to withdraw $12 billion in foreign currency reserves from American banks, President Carter ordered a freeze on all official Iranian assets held by the United States. U.S. officials put those Iranian assets at $6 billion, saying the Iranian figure was too high. In order to take the action, Mr. Carter said the country was faced with a national emergency, a threat to its security and economy. It's the first emergency he's declared since taking office. Robert Pierpoint at the White House has more on the story.
Treasury Secretary William Miller said he got word of the Iranian government's move to withdraw its funds from American banks about 5 this morning and acted immediately to counter it. By 5:45, the documents were ready, and Miller called the president, who decided to delay while other governments were informed. Mr. Carter signed the papers at 8 o'clock, effectively blocking the transfer of any money or property belonging to the government of Iran out of this country. Later, Miller was asked how the action might affect the American hostages in Tehran.
This action is taken in response to an Iranian action to protect American interests and is not taken either to cause any difficulty for the hostages or as an act that by itself would hasten their release.
Miller emphasized that President Carter's action does not directly affect private trade, such as the shipment of food to Iran.
The purpose of this action is not to block trade. We are putting no export limits and such, so we're not stopping commercial transactions. I think that shippers of food can be paid from the other assets. Iranian government has substantial resources, and they have deposits in banks of other nationals, which they have not pulled out and not threatened to pull down below the claims of those countries. So there is a way to settle transactions outside of U.S. deposits.
But for the transfer of anything belonging to the Iranian government, permission must be obtained from the Foreign Assets Control Office of the Treasury Department, which was flooded today with phone calls and queries. The touchy issue of food is becoming more complicated. The Carter administration has heretofore hinted it would not use food as a weapon to help the hostages. Today, however, Press Secretary Jody Powell pointedly reminded reporters of who had started all this and how it could end quickly with the hostages released. Robert Pierpoint, CBS News at the White House.
Most Arab governments say they favor President Carter's imposing a freeze on Iranian assets in the United States. Saudi Arabia called it a very sound decision. Bahrain said it's high time Ayatollah Khomeini got some of his own medicine. Kuwait said it had no objection. Only Iraq and Libya, among Arab League members, voiced reservations. President Carter's action against Iran, while extraordinary, is not without precedent, as Ray Brady tells us.
It's a drastic action, one the Japanese said was so serious they had to attack Pearl Harbor. One used after Castro took power in Cuba. One used at the end of the Vietnam War. Banking analysts say the U.S. action is drastic but simple. It's as if a person were to try to cash a check on his or her account, but was told by the bank that the funds in the account had been blocked by the U.S. government. Ironically, here at the Federal Reserve Bank in New York City, the U.S. government itself may be the single biggest holder of Iranian money in this country. Inside these walls are $1.3 billion in U.S. Treasury bills held here for Iran. American banks hold some of the frozen assets. Others are properties, such as two 747s on which Iranian airlines had already made deposits. Also affected, Iranian students in this country who get funds from their government, and Iranian banks in this country because they are branches of the government. Iran may retaliate economically, but analysts say this is one round the U.S. stands to win. Among Iranian assets here are those U.S. government bills, deposits made for shipments of goods from the U.S., various stocks and bank deposits, and an unknown amount of real estate, all totaling around $6 billion, though some analysts suspect the total could be much higher. On the other side of the scale, about $500 million in U.S. business assets in Iran and roughly $3 billion in loans to Iran from U.S. banks, a total of $3.4 billion.
We come out ahead because we hold more assets. If it is true economic war, we would come out ahead.
The branches of U.S. banks abroad also will freeze any Iranian funds they have, though there is some question if the action will hold up in international courts.
The legal ramifications of that, I'm not expert enough to give you a good answer, so I wouldn't try.
But you have ordered your foreign branches not to pay any Iranian demand withdrawal?
That's correct. That's what the president's order asked us to do, and we complied with it immediately.
Most analysts say the situation is so unprecedented that nobody can be sure what will happen next. But they are comparing it to an international game of economic poker, one in which the United States now has raised the stakes, and the next move is up to the Ayatollah Khomeini. Ray Brady, CBS News, New York.
U.S. officials said the Iranian embassy will have to get a special license to write checks covering normal embassy business expenses. As for the embassy building itself, Iran will not be able to sell it or any other real estate in this country so long as the freeze is in effect. The presidential order freezing Iran's assets in the United States plunged relations between the two countries even lower, if that's possible. With today's report from Tehran, here's Randy Daniels.
The Iranian government reacted sharply to the freeze on Iranian assets, calling the move illegal and another example of the United States' domination of third world countries. Sadiq Gobzadeh, a leading member of the Iranian Revolutionary Council, also condemned the move as an escalation of the political crisis.
The fate of the hostages, it depends on the actions of American government. Apparently, American government doesn't want to do anything for that. On the contrary, the American government seems to be happy because they can get that excuse to escalate the things.
As the United States and Iran were taking economic steps against each other, thousands of Iranians again demonstrated outside the American embassy. This was the largest and the most excited crowd in 5 days. The Iranian Air Force sent an entire division, 10,000 men, to show the nation and the United States that the military is solidly behind Ayatollah Khomeini and the students occupying the embassy. For the second day, a large detachment from the army also demonstrated outside the embassy. But civilians outnumbered them all, shouting a refrain of anti-American slogans that have become standard on the streets of Tehran. There are reports that 2 hostages, possibly Iranian employees of the American embassy, have been released. Tehran radio also reported that Ayatollah Khomeini personally ordered telephone service at the embassy restored. Randy Daniels, CBS News, Tehran.
Iran's request for an emergency UN Security Council debate on the embassy crisis has been stalled by American diplomatic muscle. Following some intense U.S. pressure, the Security Council agreed just to continue consulting on the Iranian request until those American hostages are freed. More on the story from Marvin Kalb.
The U.S. suddenly sensed that it was being put on the defensive by Iran's diplomatic moves, so it sent Secretary of State Vance to the UN to block a Security Council debate of the crisis. Vance succeeded, and the U.S. then sharpened its diplomatic rhetoric. One official saying bluntly, "We are engaged in political and economic warfare against Iran." Spokesman Harding Carter, reflecting the deepening frustration here, said the U.S. would not be put on trial, that it was the U.S. that was and is being wronged.
There is no way that this government can or will negotiate under the gun of its people being held illegally within our own compound in Iran.
After his UN meetings, Vance stressed the release of the hostages must come before any UN debate.
The United States and the others are addressing the primary issue which is before them, namely the question of the release of hostages. Once that issue is addressed, then we're prepared to go forward with the Security Council meeting to deal with all issues.
Though the U.S. has received widespread rhetorical support from its allies, it has not yet succeeded in coordinating a program of political and economic sanctions against Iran for seizing the hostages and thus violating international law. This is a source of considerable disappointment here, but it is explained by the allies' dependence upon Iranian oil. Marvin Kalb, CBS News, the State Department.
The nervousness in the Middle East as a result of the Iran crisis is being exemplified by reports of U.S. military moves. One report had U.S. paratroopers landing in Bahrain, a report denied by that country and the United States. A Kuwaiti report had the United States telling Persian Gulf area nations it would take military action if diplomacy failed to free the hostages. The State Department denied that one too. At the center of this diplomatic storm is the exiled Shah of Iran, of course. Just how much wealth he took with him when he fled is not known, nor is it known how much money he had invested outside Iran at the time. But as of last February, his Pahlavi Foundation, with international holdings, is worth an estimated $25 billion. The Shah has been under treatment at a New York City hospital for cancer. His doctors earlier had said that to move him from the hospital would endanger his life, a risk that removed any attempt to get him out of the country. But a new prognosis could provide a way out of this current impasse. Jerry Landay reports.
Sources close to the case say the Shah could be discharged from New York Hospital and leave the United States within 2 weeks, far earlier than the initial recommendations of his medical team. CBS News has learned that since Monday, the Shah's been receiving daily radiation therapy just across the street at Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital, which specializes in cancer treatment. He's been moved secretly under tight security in the middle of the night through a tunnel connecting the two hospitals. The new 2-week estimate for the departure of the Shah is a drastic revision of the original recommendation of the Shah's medical team. An estimate that he would need a month or more to convalesce from surgery, then as long as a half year as a resident in the New York area to receive chemotherapy for his cancer. Jerry Landay, CBS News, New York.
While reports indicate that the Shah could be moved within 2 weeks, the State Department tonight denied broadcast reports that he would return to Mexico in the immediate future. An American who was at the embassy during its takeover and managed to escape said today there were others who also got away and may be in hiding now in Tehran. Kim King, a 26-year-old who'd been teaching English to Iranian businessmen, said 8 other Americans, including some Marines, escaped with him. He said he was able to get out with the help of Iranian friends. King now is staying with his parents in the state of Washington. A powerful earthquake rocked northeastern Iran today, devastating at least 18 villages. The Iranian news agency reported 242 persons killed, but rescue workers said the death toll was at least 500. In Washington, the White House said it has not considered whether any U.S. relief aid would be offered. The United States usually is quick with such an offer. The Israeli government has reaffirmed its decision to deport the Arab mayor of Nablus in the occupied West Bank because of his vocal sympathies for PLO terrorism. All the elected officials in the area's 25 towns immediately resigned in protest. The dollar fell sharply today in reaction to the news from Iran, but gold managed only a modest gain. One trader said, "It appears that gold is no longer the valium of the world." And the stock market rallied after an early slump to finish up in moderate trading. NASA officials met with President Carter today and later said he expressed full support for the troubled manned space shuttle program and said he was willing to spend several $100 million extra to get the shuttle on track. Technical problems have delayed the shuttle's first launch for more than a year now, since it's counted on as a major tool to verify Russian compliance with the arms limitation program. The White House asked for today's briefing. Space officials assured him the difficulties are not major or intrinsic flaws with the engine, but were typical set of development problems. Announcing a presidential candidacy is not merely a matter of standing up and saying, "I'm running." No, indeed. As Roger Mudd reports, there are rules and ritual to be observed.
The first rule is wear a blue suit. The tie can be polka dot, or it can be a nice sincere stripe, or it can even be maroon. And the shirt can be white, but the suit has got to be blue. Rule 2, have your speechwriters come up with at least one quotable phrase.
I approach this task with confidence in our capacity to open widening horizons of opportunity and destiny.
I believe that together, you and I can keep our rendezvous with destiny.
It's time to wake up America, to build for the future, not steal from it. My principles are simple. Protect the earth, serve the people, and explore the universe.
Judge me, then come with me, and let us reach for the future and make it ours.
Rule 3, the best prop you have is a good-looking wife and handsome children. So use them. By all means, use them. Put them on display. Hold them up if you can. Rule 3B, if the kids are grown and gone, then make sure you bring the wife. Rule 3C, if you're not married, you're on your own. Rule 4, always get close to a dead patriot.
Teddy Roosevelt.
Teddy Roosevelt.
John Hancock and Sam Adams.
Franklin Roosevelt.
Abraham Lincoln.
Tom Paine.
Rule 5, try to have the flag in the picture. Old Glory is the best, of course, but state flags give off a nice warm feeling. Rule 6, make sure your actual announcement sentence cannot be edited or taken out of context.
Today I
am announcing I am a
candidate
for the office of President
of the United States.
Thank you.
There is no rule on where to announce. Some go home to Russell, Kansas, or to Boston to do it. Others hire the National Press Club ballroom. Members of the Congress generally seem to use this big Senate caucus room or one of the Capitol's other reception rooms. Maybe because it's easier, maybe because it's rent-free. But there is a Rule 8. It is, when you don't know what to do next, kiss your wife. Kiss her and then keep on kissing her. She may not love it, but the photographers will. And the pictures just might get you on every front page in America, even though your announcement will not. Roger Mudd, CBS News, Capitol Hill.
And that's the way it is. Wednesday, November 14th, 1979. This is Walter Cronkite, CBS News. Good night.
This has been the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. For the latest information on the situation in Iran, watch Thursday Morning with Bob Schieffer tomorrow. This is CBS.